So it's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for Darwin Day 2023. And we invited Janet some years ago, and then something called COVID intervened, and there was discussion about whether or not she might give her lecture on Zoom. And I must say, we all felt that we wanted her to be here in person for a whole variety of different reasons, many of which are perfectly obvious. Now, I think we all know, but just let's be clear, that Darwin stands out as by far one of the greatest scientists in the history of civilization, and changed the way we thought about life, biology, and being human. I know that Janet is going to explain that he came of his time, and we're going to find him as a man of his time, and linking in with the people of his time. And that, of course, will be tremendously interesting. But nevertheless, this book, The Origin of Species, did, in fact, change the world, because he put it down in such a way, and in such a beautiful way, that people paid attention. People followed him. Very significant figures in Britain in particular, also in other parts of the world, took up his ideas, and he pursued them in a quiet and gentle way. He was not a controversialist. He was almost the opposite. He was the essence of politeness and decency and goodness. He was a conservative person. He didn't want to disrupt the way people thought, although in fact he did. And in fact, when as we fully understand what he discovered, we can understand fully why he changed the world in such a way. He changed the world of science, but he also changed the way people think about themselves. He answered that extraordinary question which agonizes people to this day: where did we come from? Why are we here? What is our purpose? All of these questions, in essence, are answered in this book. And the answers are not very nice, actually. They're not enormously fulfilling. We know we came here by chance. We know that biology has no purpose. We don't know where it began originally. We're in a kind of vacuum of ignorance. But we are here. And the other thing about us is we can look at each other, and especially look at other people and say, you are wonderful. In other words, looking each of you at other people around here, you must surely wonder at the extraordinary qualities of the human being. But you can also, of course, wonder about the true wonder about the beauty and the exceptional qualities of any living thing. And as Darwin says at the end, the most wondrous things came out of a very small beginning, perhaps out of one beginning. So he created, in a way, a place for people to think about themselves as human beings, without any crutches, without any needs for the supernatural, without any need for approval, without any thought of retribution after life is ended. All of that evaporated as Darwin's ideas took root, and have essentially swept the world in a wonderful way, and have contributed enormously, I think, to us as humanists, that we can speak to people who are wondering about the nature of life, the origin of life, the purposes of life, and so on. We can explain to them this wonderful book and the wonderful ideas that are contained in it. But of course, it's not just enough to have a book of ideas. Published in 1859. You also need people to write about the ideas. Look at those. They're heavier than this. And these are Janet Brown's 2-volume, magnificent biography of Darwin, written 20 years ago, and absolutely wonderful. Now, Darwin writes beautifully, but I promise you, read Janet Brown's biographies of Darwin, and you will also see wonderful writing. She started, and this gives me enormous pride, she started her academic career here at Trinity, coming from England. She was explaining to me of the great idea of her father that she should come here. and began to study science and graduated in zoology in 1972. And while she was here, she attended a course of lectures given by a great man, David Webb, who wrote The Flora of Ireland. Some of you who are keen botanists, you know The Flora of Ireland. And David Webb gave a series of lectures on how to think about a lot of other things apart from botany. And one of the things he suggested was that the history of science is interesting. And Janet decided that might be interesting. And she went to Imperial College and took a master's in the history of science, and then a PhD in the history of science, but right from the beginning, focusing on Darwin. Biogeography was her subject of her thesis, a great interest of Darwin, and then on to the Wellcome Trust, which has funded studies in the history of science for many years, ever since its establishment. And spent many years there, some years in Cambridge, England, working on the Darwinian project, on the Darwin correspondence project. An enormous correspondence had to be put together, edited, so on and so forth, and published. And then, 15 years ago, she was appointed as the founding holder of the Avenant Chair of History of Science at Harvard University. And I know, for a whole variety of different reasons, what an impression she has made on the faculty of Harvard. Now acknowledged she is as one of the very greatest authorities on Darwin. So you can imagine how lucky we are that she has been willing to come back here to her alma mater and to talk to us today. So without further ado, may I introduce Janet Browne, and we look forward very much, Janet, to your thoughts on Darwin.
Goodness me. Thank you, David. What an eloquent and wonderful introduction. You're so generous. And welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. I do want to say a very big and enthusiastic thank you to Gillian and to the Board of Directors of the Humanist Association, who invited me and who have made my stay, it's only been a weekend, made my stay such a pleasure, such a delight to be here. And especially want to thank David in a different way, certainly for your introduction, but also you've been such a generous host, and I do feel that your energy is terrific in making everything go right in the world, so thank you very much. So of course it's very special for me to be back here at Trinity. I was a very happy undergraduate here, and I've now been in this building, which is rather interesting. It wasn't here when I was here, so this is new to me. And especially, it's nice for me that there are some very dear friends in this audience who have come to hear me talk, which is just delightful. And if the pandemic hadn't struck, I would have been here earlier. So I'm honoured to be invited to talk about Darwin on your Darwin Day, which is an annual event celebrating Darwin's birthday, which happened yesterday. It's the 12th of February, and yesterday he reached the grand old age of 214 years old. So very much the end picture. And the day's more than just a birthday celebration. Perhaps some of you have been to other Darwin Day celebrations. But by gathering together, we, as a humanist audience, are taking part in a very long-standing tradition of promoting freedom of thought by uniting it with the scope and impact of Darwin's writings. So humanists have had a lot to do with creating and celebrating Darwin Days in the past. The very first Darwin Day was organized by the Humanist Association in the USA in the 1990s, and they actually do go further back than that, certainly to 1952, when Julian Huxley, the noted humanist, evolutionist and first Director General of the UNESCO, he gave a speech. And I think this was Amsterdam, 1952. I think it must have been the first International Congress in Amsterdam, where in his speech he explicitly linked Darwinism and evolutionary biology through natural selection with humanism. So I think it goes back a very long way, this kind of event. And since then, humanist associations all over the globe have celebrated Darwin's Day. Many of them sound quite good fun. I mean, ours is going to be fun, clearly, but these ones sound very American. There's a Charlie Darwin chili cookout in Florida in 2018. And in Chicago, there was creationist bingo. I'm afraid I can't offer. And I'm not quite sure what that might consist of. So my point is really only to say that humanist associations like this have been very significant in both promoting Darwinism and on making the central values of science more widely known, the rationality, the reason behind science more widely known. So even before Julian Huxley's speech, there were plenty of people willing to give Darwin, willing to see Darwin as a figurehead for all forms of advanced secular thinking. And so from the mid-Victorian period, right through to today, there have been a whole host of ways of acknowledging Darwin's impact. And I want to show you some of those now before we get into his religion. So the very first, oops, Daisy, not the right one. Not the right one. So sorry. Okay, back again. The very first one was a mountain in Tierra del Fuego that was named after Darwin as a birthday tribute. So it was named on the 12th of February, but in 1834, by his captain, Robert Fitzroy, on the Beagle voyage. So right from the age of 25, Darwin was accustomed to his birthday being celebrated. This is very unusual to have a mountain named after you. More conventionally, after he became so tremendously famous, there were, of course, many portraits that celebrated Darwin's life, his times. This was taken during his lifetime and is a very beautiful, moving image that people enjoy to have around. There are many others. I've just chosen to show you this one. As well as portraits, of course, there are statues. This astonishingly sort of classically oriented statue by Joseph Bowen is in the London Natural History Museum. And there is Thomas Henry Huxley with the paper in front of it, opening the event after Darwin's death. This was made by subscription to commemorate Darwin's great work. Other ways of commemorating Darwin's great work were to open a museum in his house. It's a very conventional thing to do, but nevertheless there are not many museums for scientists, and this is a lovely museum if you get a chance to visit it in Kent. Opened in 1925 and subsequently closed and opened again and reworked, and it's now beautiful and reopened for you to go and see. Celebrating Darwin, celebrating his triumph and his intellectual movement. Other more conventional ways of commemorating Darwin are, of course, to collect books. But you may not be familiar with the sorts of things that were issued in Darwin's own time. There were songs called the Darwinian Theory. There was a beautiful china decorated with a revolutionary tree and children's books. And today, there's all kinds of interesting ways to commemorate Darwin, and I've just got a few images to show you. There's a computer program named Darwin. There are people tattooing themselves with, or this possibly is just ballpoint and not quite sure it's real tattoo, but clearly it's a very significant part of a young person's life if they wish to show Darwin on their body. So that's one thing that I've been very interested in following through. As well as tattoos, there's also things like beer, commemorative beer, commemorative downfall. And the last thing I wish to show you is that there's a Twitter feed. Darwin has an online presence. And I don't know who does it. Somebody does it, but they do. So these various forms of commemoration, also many more I can show you, are clearly commodification in a sense, but they're also revealing the commitment, the conviction that Darwin introduced an entirely new way of thinking about nature, as David so eloquently referenced it. Darwin genuinely did introduce the book that helped people think about how they related to the natural world, how they related to possible creator and the whole secular, rational view that he introduced. It was very carefully written, his book. I'll show you an image of the book. It was a view grounded in very careful evidence, careful analysis of evidence, very cautious use of theory, and Darwin's personal combination of courage, took a lot to produce this book, and modesty in making his proposals. So most famously, he was one of the leading figures in the controversies between science and religion. I want to talk a bit about that. And the book, this book, On the Origin of Species, was one of the major stimuli in revolutionizing our views. After Darwin, it was much harder to believe in Adam and Eve, or the Garden of Eden. And his name became so famous that it even obscures the impact of Alfred Russel Wallace, who simultaneously, very nearly simultaneously, came up with the same theory, whose centenary also falls this year. But I bet you didn't know that. He's obscured, unfairly, I think. Wallace was born 100 years ago this year, and it will be very hard to find a similar run of knickknacks that celebrate Wallace in the same way that I've just shown you now for Darwin, although I have to say I've got my t-shirt. So it's Darwin, not Wallace, not any of the others, who have emerged as the symbol of science and rationalism and secularism. And it's this probably that I've imagined attracted Julian Huxley and the many others who have linked humanism and alternatives to the Christian story. And the links between humanism and Darwin are very strong. So here's the origin of species that I wanted to show you. Now I'm going to speak tonight about Darwin and religion, the religion of his day, and specifically about Darwin's own religious beliefs and how they declined into a form of agnosticism as he increasingly gave his life to science. It was a gradual process. And Darwin said himself later in life that he was never an atheist, although many of his readers attributed those ideas to him. When his close friend Thomas Henry Huxley invented the word agnostic, Darwin used this to describe himself in the sense of not knowing what ultimate powers or forces might exist underneath the material world. He was generally very cautious when talking about the possibility of a creator, and this was a courtesy to his readers, to his family, to his many friends who were believers of one sort or another. So he never denied the existence of a creator. but he had private views that I want to explore with you tonight. And particularly I find it of interest because there was a letter that came up for sale quite recently, 2015, where Darwin was unusually frank and unusually sharp. He was writing to a clergyman who had obviously pressed him for what did he believe, and Darwin wrote back, "Dear sir, I'm sorry to have to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation, and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Yours sincerely, Charles Darwin." So it's kind of sharp, isn't it? That's the only statement in our 16,000 letters where he really says what he doesn't believe in. And perhaps you'll see that he's not saying he doesn't believe in a spiritual force. He's saying he doesn't believe in the Bible, doesn't believe in Jesus, and he can't imagine that the words of the church doctrines are actually true. So he did reject conventional Christianity, and it was a scientific friend of mine that brought him to that point. That's where I want to go today. So let's just backtrack and acknowledge Darwin's achievement. David's opened the floor for these amazing remarks about what he did achieve. We don't need reminding that The Origin of Species made its author one of the most prominent naturalists in the world. First among the scientific men of England, as Edward Aveling put it, a socialist philosopher. And we don't really need reminding that this book, which was published in 1859, excited intense attention for its scope, its careful analysis, weighty accumulation of facts, but also for the absence, for some people, a liberating absence of any allusion to the biblical story of creation. So this combination of features was sure to generate controversy. This is 1859 in Victorian England. Was Darwin proposing that humans came from ape ancestors? He wasn't. But nevertheless, that was what was talked about afterwards. Should God be banished from the whole of nature? He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't mention that, but nevertheless, that was the big question after he published. And they're huge questions that are still, to some degree, discussed today. So The Origin of Species is surely the major publishing event of the 19th century. Dramatically changed the way that we think about science, how we think about ourselves, and it helped to lay the foundations of the modern world. So you'll probably know, as a young man before setting sail on the Beagle voyage, Darwin had gone quite a long way along the road of becoming a clergyman. His father had suggested that he should join the church since he was rejecting medicine as a career, and Darwin, it seems, had not got the intellectual substance to go into the law or any of the other kinds of things. He didn't want to join the army, and his father said, "Okay, you join the church." And his father sent him to the University of Cambridge to do the general degree, which was a preliminary to taking holy orders. And afterwards, of course, Darwin always enjoyed the irony of intending to be a clergyman. He called it ludicrous that he should have been intended to be a clergyman. He had an early religious training background, rather low-key. He had been brought up in the Unitarian faith in Shrewsbury in England, but his father, his grandfather, his brother, and he himself were not particularly committed. Unitarianism, as you probably know, is very closely allied to the origins of humanism. It was developed in the 18th century by mathematicians and philosophers who really didn't like the idea of a trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and they preferred to base their faith entirely on reason and evidence. So there was a Darwin family saying that Unitarianism was a featherbed to catch a falling Christian. And it allowed an awful lot of leeway. The family, the menfolk, certainly the family, didn't go to church, but nevertheless they participated in civic life. They were traditional middle-class participants. They didn't have to express any belief system in order to be part of the Shrewsbury civic life. And Charles Darwin, the son, our subject today, took that frame of mind with him to Cambridge University, where he was meant to be training for the church. And perhaps he might have made a good clergyman. At Cambridge, he very enthusiastically embraced the works of William Paley, who put forward the view of natural theology, that's the title of the book at the top. And Darwin said that he liked Paley's viewpoint because Paley insisted that everything in the natural world was beautifully adapted to carry out its function. And because of the adaptation of Paley's world, that meant that there must be design. We cannot have something that works well without there having been a designer. And for Paley, the remaining part of the structure was that all design things must have a designer. So that Darwin found this scheme allowed a whole crowd of young men to enjoy the natural world, to appreciate its differences, its marvelous adaptations, its exquisite structures, and that they could see that that was evidence for there being a creator. Darwin ignored most of his curriculum, except for Paley, and threw himself into understanding natural history and became a passionate beetle collector. And these are little sketches made by his friends after a beetle collection, where you can see that Darwin has been sat upon a beetle. On the left there, Darwin on his hobby. And here he is on another beetle, on his way to Cambridge with Going Charlie underneath. That's where his passion was. And it's that passion for natural history that singled him out when they were looking for a young person to go on the beagle voyage. He did, at that time, genuinely believe that there was a creator and that the natural world was the expression of the creator's works. It was on the beagle voyage that he lost all that. And so it's very interesting for us to see how he lost his faith. He says in his autobiography, the belief, my belief in Paley's perfect adaptations died a natural death when, on leaving Cambridge University, I, Darwin, joined the Beagle as naturalist. So he knew that that was what did it. It didn't do it completely, which is what I want to argue, but he certainly began to notice, as he went around the world, it's a 5-year trip around the world, he noticed that many adaptations in living organisms, living beings, many adaptations were not perfect. But that took him a while. He was reluctant, he said, to give up the sense of the sublime that he felt when he was on top of the mountains of the Andes, when he saw the stars, when he was traveling across the pampas with a party of gauchos, camping, when he was in the Brazilian rainforest. He says he felt convinced that there's more in mankind, than the mere breath of his body. So he was already tilting towards feeling something spiritual, but not necessarily identifying it with a designer. So when he was on board ship, What I want to argue is that there was a number of encounters with indigenous human beings that particularly unsettled his ideas. We know, of course, always about the finches on the Galapagos Islands, we know about other kinds of things in the animal world, but I want to suggest to you that there was another thread of puzzlement that emerged when he encountered indigenous human beings. The beagle went all around the world, went to a lot of very wild places, and this was something that he found exceptionally interesting, and it worried him how he should be handling the information that he was getting. Here is a beautiful image by the ship's artist. It's the beagle and the tender to the beagle that's just on the left of the image in one of the bays in Tierra del Fuego with a group of Fuegians on their canoe hailing the boat. It's a real image, so to speak. This actually took place, but it has become deeply representative for a lot of encounters between different kinds of people during the mid-Victorian colonial period. It shows in an absolutely visual sense the two worlds meeting here in the bay. And that was what worried and puzzled Darwin, the two worlds that he was seeing. He was shocked by what he saw of the indigenous Fuegians, and more particularly, he was shocked by comparing those with three other Fuegians, perhaps you know, were living on board the Beagle, who had been to England for 3 years and had been educated in a Christian mission and were being repatriated with an English missionary in order to set up a Protestant mission station in the far south. So there were three on board who you might say were Europeanized, Christianized, dressed in European clothes, and they were all the indigenous peoples flooding down over hills to see the ship and to engage with the people on the ship. And this is captured by Darwin quite a lot in his book on the voyage of the Beagle, and later on a little bit in The Descent of Man, but most particularly in his letters, where he's very speaks more freely in his letters. He felt, here is an illustration by the same artist who did the encounter scene of a local Fuegian, somebody who had not been to Europe, and one of the three that was called by the sailors Jemmy Button, as he had been purchased for a button on the 3 years ago, who here is in his European dress. The comparison was astonishing to Darwin, and he could not have believed how wide was the difference. And that took him into thinking much more carefully about the culture of the various sorts of people that he met, and his recognition that there was a great deal of religious pluralism around the world, that his own Christian structure was no more real than the pagan beliefs that these people had, or the very sophisticated polytheism of the Maoris that he then met, or the individuals he met in Australia and South Africa. He came to think that Christianity was just a belief, just like anything else. And by the time he returned from the voyage, he really did feel that the Bible could hardly be true, and that the practices of the Anglican Church were just convention. He writes about it. He says, "Disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress and have never since doubted, even for a single second, that my conclusion was correct. And so I would like to just say that after he came back from the Blue War, as far as I can tell from the archive, he never afterwards went to any church of any kind, no church services, except for his own marriage and his brother's funeral and his own funeral. So he just pulled back. He actually meant to go to his father's funeral, but the stagecoach, he missed the stage, he didn't get there in time, and he always pulled back off of other funerals, even of his best friends. But he only went to church 3 more times after that, which made it difficult when he got married. He married a woman who was his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, from the China Company in England, a very prosperous young woman, but also he very dearly loved her and delayed proposing for quite some time until he felt sure that she would accept. I think perhaps many people have that kind of situation. You don't chance that sort of request. So he married his cousin Emma in the very last weeks of 1839, and he was always very careful and loving in his relationship with her and in acknowledging her own religious belief, which was quite strong. And she wasn't a zealot, but she did believe, there's no question about that. Perceptively, Emma told him quite early on in their marriage that she felt his scientific frame of mind was pushing him away from God. It was pushing him towards denying the existence of a creator. So she nailed it, absolutely. And he never found the words to tell her that that was true. He couldn't tell her that. But she knew that it was true. And one feature of their lives together brought this home with a punch. Here they are with some of their children. These are very early photographs. Darwin left there with William, the oldest boy, the oldest child, and a son. Emma with Leonard, who they thought was the last child, but there were another 2 after that. And the daughter Anne, his eldest daughter. Anne died, and he died of sudden childhood infection. It could have been TB. It was certainly a very gastrointestinal, horrible and rapid infection. He died very quickly. And that blow was very hard for both of them to take. Darwin never really recovered from his grief, and he raged against a God who would let a child die. Certainly a child die in suffering. And his wife, they obviously talked about this, his wife at least had the consolation that she believed there was a spiritual afterlife, and that she would meet the daughter in heaven eventually. And Darwin didn't have that belief. He rejected the idea of heaven and hell, and he saw only emptiness. So I think that was the moment that he absolutely abandoned faith of any kind, gave up all pretense of belief. So what I'm suggesting is not rocket science, it's just suggesting that we can see Darwin as a young man turning himself into a scientist on the Beagle voyage and gradually relinquishing belief in a designer God, the God that he had been taught at Cambridge University, and facing up to different kinds of religious belief systems that helped him recognize Christianity was just one of many beliefs. He behaved very tenderly towards his wife's belief in Christianity, yet he lost all his own belief in Christianity after the death of his daughter. So when he came to write The Origin, he was able to think about species and their origins without any reference to divine design or an original creation. And he generated a text that spoke eloquently about the power of rationality and a secular view of science that impressed a large number of his readers. So I want to turn to other evolutionists, other naturalists of the time. How did they respond to Darwin's book? Did their scientific commitments lead them into skepticism like Darwin? So the Victorian era is very famous for the fracturing of the Protestant church into lots of different denominations and schools of thought, even before Darwin published. So here we have three other evolutionary thinkers, Herbert Spencer, Robert Chambers, and Alfred Russel Wallace. So Herbert Spencer absolutely declared himself an agnostic, using Huxley's word, although Spencer thought he had invented it. And there's actually quite some good evidence for that. Spencer was influenced as a boy by Quakerism and the Unitarians, and he denied all forms of organized religion in favor of science. He mostly followed August Comte's positivism. Interesting fellow. Robert Chambers, the guy in the middle, was much more cautious and called himself a deist, who pushed God right into the background but never quite got rid of him. Chambers was the anonymous author of a book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. It was published in 1844, that outlined a very remarkable evolutionary scheme, except it doesn't have natural selection in it. It's just, Chambers called it a law of development. So it's completely evolutionary, but not like Darwin's evolution. And Chambers proposed that his universal law of development was set into motion by a creator who then left everything to operate according to natural laws that the same creator had put into operation. So his views gained a lot of support because it was kind of a middle road for many Victorians, and it helped pave the way to individuals to accept evolutionary ideas when Darwin then wrote and produced a more comprehensive scheme, generally. And Alfred Russel Wallace, who I'm very fond of. Here he is in Singapore. He took a line all of his own, such an unusual man, by adopting spiritualism after the 1850s and urging his scientific friends to give it a chance. He pointed out all the evidence for a world existing beyond matter, but not a Christian world of heaven. It was spirits. And he felt that people should at least explore the possibility as an alternative to conventional religious practice. Darwin and Huxley and a number of other people, Spencer here, found it preposterous. They couldn't, they certainly didn't adopt it, and they found it actually rather amusing. Even when Wallace persuaded them to attend a seance, which they did, and there were knockings and movings and all sorts of things, and they both said afterwards that it was absolutely faked. So Wallace was out on his own in this area, and it made him seem increasingly eccentric through the second half of the 19th century, when evolution was being talked about. Some people were agreeing with it, and nobody in the scientific world followed Wallace in thinking that there was a world of the spirits. And there weren't many people who thought there was a world of the spirits, but not scientific people. And then, who else have we got? We've famously got Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's best friend, and one of the most prominent people in using the controversies of evolution to attack the religious establishment. he enjoyed every opportunity that he could find to separate science from the theological foundations that people like Paley insisted on. Paley died by this point, but famously you may know of the debate at Oxford University, the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1860, when Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, was asked to speak about evolutionary theory. What did the church think about evolutionary theory? And of course, as you might expect, he said that it was clearly not true. There was a creator and that human beings were created. And at the meeting, we don't know exactly what happened, but apparently Bishop Wilberforce turned to Huxley and asked him, did he claim his descent from an ape through his grandmother or his grandfather? Huxley, so clever, so sharp, good with words. Huxley jumped up and he said he'd rather have an ape for an ancestor than somebody who twists the truth like you do, or words to that effect. So very famously, this back and forth became representative of the church and science in opposition, in conflict. And Huxley loved that and worked with it for the rest of his life. He agreed with every editor who wanted a critical article about the church that he would write it. And he became very learned about church history because he used it in order to attack the church itself. So Darwin didn't like any of this, didn't engage in any of this sort of public defense of his views. He was only too glad that Huxley took it on. He recognized that Huxley did a great deal to encourage thinkers who were increasingly ready to accept secular views. So before I conclude, coming up to conclude now, I just want to speak about two other people who are not so well known, at least, well, maybe they are well known, I don't know. Two other people who represent different ends of the spectrum in the various responses to Darwin's theories. Each of them a clergyman, each of them committed to scientific rationality, but with different results, just to show you the range of opinion. Here is Daniel Moncure Conway, an American abolitionist and writer. And he took holy orders in the United States on the East Coast, and for a while he practiced as a transcendentalist with Emerson and others. And he moved to London specifically to deliver public talks about encouraging British people of these islands, as it happens, to support the North in the American Civil War. There was quite a period when it looked as if the British Parliament might in fact support the South. And he was over in England anyway, to support the North in the Civil War, and he changed course to set up a church for free thinkers in the South Place Chapel in London. And there he defended Darwinism whilst promoting a very loose form of Unitarianism. And I thought it was quite interesting that he had an ability to support science whilst also advocating spiritual freedom. So it may well have been a compromise, but Darwin liked him and admired what he was doing. I like and admire him too, for showing that one could be a Darwinist and a Christian of sorts, although a very unusual kind of Christian. And because we're gathered here at Trinity, I wanted to include Samuel Horton, the geologist, brilliant 19th century professor of mathematics, and occasional clergyman and geologist. So he understood Darwin's theories only too well, However, he felt that evolution by natural selection was really not much more than just rehashing the ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He thought it was just another reworking of transmutation. Hence, he was very witty when he delivered an aphorism in a meeting of the Irish Geological Society in 1859, saying of the origin of species, of Darwin and Wallace, if it means what it says, it's a truism, and if it means anything else, it's contrary to fact. He shows, among other things, that a man could oppose Darwinism with humour and with gentlemanly spirit. So it seems to me that Conway and Horton independently reveal that the divide between science and religion that Huxley kind of codified, it was never absolute in Victorian times. It was a spectrum of views. So I want to conclude very briefly by saying humanists have been celebrating Darwin's place in history for 3 decades. I hope, and I intended to illustrate something of the development of his mind and his engagement with the embedded religious doctrines of his day. He was not a zealot. He attempted to find a truth for himself and thought that it explained so much that he would describe it in his books. And I'd like to conclude with some words that Darwin himself wrote in his autobiography that seem particularly relevant to us today. He said, "Freedom of thought is best promoted by the gradual illumination of men's minds which follows from the advance of science." And I think he truly believed that. So thank you very much.
Of my groups. You must feel that this has been so profound that, in such a gentle talk, in a gentle way, you heard from somebody who has lived with Darwin who's lived with Darwin since 1972. I mean, we're talking about 50 years. And every word you heard from Janet, you knew it had been weighed through all these measured comments, giving you such a feeling for Darwin. Totally honest and a view of integrity, analysing it, drawing him out as he proceeded through his life. That tragic moment, tragic time when his daughter Anne died. And I had heard that before, that this was the time when any doubts that he had were removed. And there was that lovely quotation at the end about the importance of freedom of thought and its relationship to learning more and paying attention to science. It's just terrific. So it's absolutely wonderful, really wonderful. I'm so glad you've come and spoken to us. And now, I'm sure there are people who would like to ask questions. At the back, please.
Could you tell me how Darwin funded himself in the early part of his career, all of his career? I mean, I know he married somebody from a very wealthy background, but before that?
Rather wonderfully, he was a wealthy man. So his father and grandfathers had been very prosperous. The Wedgwood side of the family was immensely wealthy. and Darwin had private inheritance that he was not allowed to access until after he got back from the Beagle voyage. His father kept him on a fairly tight rein. But then after he came back from the voyage, he had an inheritance. He was a trust-fund baby and had no need to take a job. He had thought about what could he do. And there's some very interesting remarks in his archive about, can I be a professor? Oh, I'd have to live in Cambridge. I wouldn't be able to go to London. And my wife would, there were all kinds of things. And then all of a sudden he came into his inheritance that he didn't know it was going to be quite so large. And could live in a very decent way. Nice big house. You saw the picture of the house that is now a museum. He had 10 children. A governess, stable hands, farmer, people who did the garden. So there was lots of people living in that house, but it was big. So it's a very pertinent question. Yes, he did not have to find a job like Huxley did. Which kind of Huxley did.
Yes, indeed, please. Down in the front first. Yes.
I just had a question in regard to the other naturalists. You were talking about how Chambers was talking about this whole the creationist picking everything up. And when you relate that to how nowadays Darwin theories are criticized by creationists, would you say that Chambers especially did like a fair amount of damage in that regard?
So Chambers never got rid of the creator.
Yeah.
So you could read Chambers today and still be a creationist. He doesn't have the Bible in it. You couldn't be a fundamentalist, but you could read Chambers today and think, if there's something up there, it's generating the earth and setting all the laws into motion and letting them run along by themselves. And that's quite attractive to a lot of people. So I don't believe Chambers has much of a presence in people's thinking today, but in his day, in the middle years of the 19th century, it was immensely popular. It was translated into German and to Dutch. And I don't think it's into French, but certainly it had a wide circulation. And there's a number of historians, it's quite funny, we're quite tribal in our way, a number of historians who are Chambers people, who know all about Chambers, who have statistics that show that Chambers' book sold an awful lot more than Darwin's. So there you have it.
Yes.
Do you think that Darwin's position on staying agnostic was due to the fact that he just didn't want to annoy people? Basically he was that polite and all that he didn't. Or that as a scientist, he didn't want to actually say there was no God because there is no proof, and so his scientific position wouldn't allow him to go there. Or that he did actually struggle himself, latency of kind of his youth or something like that, or his beliefs, or and he was happy to let Huxley go out and actually present the more stringent position.
It's a very thoughtful question, thank you. It's a little hard to be definitive because I'm not Darwin, and I rather think, probably like all of us, he had different views at different times of his life, and maybe even talking to some people who would have this view and talking to other people who were a little bit more inclined to that view. So I think he was polite. No question about that. He had a clergyman in his family. One of his best friends was a vicar in the village. They enjoyed talking to each other. And his wife was religious. So he didn't want to offend by always talking about there not being a God. So he didn't talk about God at all at home. He only talked to his friends in his letters, his scientific friends, where he could be frank. And there he appears to have adopted the middle view that you said, that science there's no evidence whatsoever for anything other than ourselves. And that's a fairly difficult view to to take even today, and certainly would be very difficult in the middle years of the 19th century. But he does seem to have that. There is nothing apart from us. So that's why I think he was very courageous in facing up to that. A lot of his friends couldn't quite go that far. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm interested in what he felt about his own anthropology. He comes across at times quite one-dimensional in terms of he's about the physical sense of being human and the scientific fact behind it. I don't know if that's the case or not. You can establish that, perhaps answer that for me. Did he ever take into consideration, well, he disallowed the spiritual world, that those, where, was he purely focused as a naturalist on the physical sense of being human? Or what was his views on psychology and the emotional side of actually, that which was also a contribution to, in terms of the full extent of what being a human being actually is?
Thank you so much for that. He wrote the most amazing book later in life called The Descent of Man, which attempts to show exactly how those qualities that we think of as being human, language, consciousness, moral sense, love for one's family, how we like to live in societies, and also other sorts of things. How he wanted to show that there's nothing uniquely special about those, that you can trace them from animals. And that was his last kind of shot in the debate, that there was no creator generating any of these things. Creator didn't give language. Creator didn't give the moral sense. And that was hard for his readers to accept, but he truly believed that.
At the back, just a moment there.
Have you a view as to why, in the hallowed sanctuary of Trinity College of all places, and on such a profound subject, why just a modest enough gathering would he come to hear you speak? And in America, would a larger group of people come to hear you speak on such an important subject?
You bet. And there'd be a creationist in the audience. Maybe more than one. And it's so interesting because of the way American politics encourages freedom of thought, but it also allows people to be fundamentalist if they wish. That's freedom. So one can't respond in a way that one might in England, because in America everyone can have their own beliefs. That's the point of America. And that's why people went to America, to escape tradition and persecution. So I'm very happy to talk about fundamentalism if anyone would wish to. Thank you for the question.
At the time, in the mid-19th century, there were two interesting things happening. One was the American Civil War. On the other hand, in Europe and other places, one of the things that a lot of scientists were doing was they were measuring skulls. And they were writing an enormous amount about the races, and which race was more superior than others, which had come from the other. So, in a sense, Darwin was in the middle of all this at the time. It was very interesting. How did Darwin approach the idea of different races amongst human beings? As a young man, he would have seen extremes, as you pointed out, of human beings at different stages of so-called civilization. What did he write about this at all?
He wrote lots. Mostly it's in The Descent of Man, or it's in his correspondence. He believed there were physical races, but there were 5, like many of his contemporaries. And there were characteristics that kept them apart. But he had a very elaborate system of what he called sexual selection that he thought generated those differences. So one could perhaps explain it very quickly by saying that he felt that physical evolution pushed apes into being early humans. And then there were all kinds of other cultural things that moved various groups of humans in different directions. So that they end up as 5 different races, which he called races, geographically distributed over the world. And he needed that kind of view so that he could account for the obvious fact that people can interbreed. They're not separate species. Whereas a number of his contemporaries did think races were separate species of human beings. So in a way, he's not a racist. But he also believed, David and I disagree on this, so we might have someone from David on this. He also believed, or certainly wrote, about there being a hierarchy of cultural development in the different races. And that's where he differed from Wallace. Darwin thought that those hierarchical cultural differences were embedded. Wallace thought that they were simply, they could be overcome. That if you could live in a Dayak hut in Sumatra and turn into a European, basically, was Wallace's idea. Darwin thought you couldn't do that. So it's such a difficult question. And The Descent of Man, which was published in 1972, had its sesquicentennial last year. A lot of this came out on the radio and other sorts of things, podcasts, as to was Darwin racist. And the verdict's still out. You know, it's hard to know how to think about these people, because we don't have the same ideas as Darwin did. We reject a lot of what he said about human beings, racial typologies. We reject a lot of the nasty competitive side of his theory in our modern economic policies. But he was a very great man, and it's a very remarkable man. So it's one of those problems of history.
You've asked me to say something.
Here's the geneticist.
Well, no, it's not on the genetics. In fact, and I'd like to ask you if this is true or not. I think Bush is right. I mean, that he believed that there were races, but he loved some of the races. I mean, it wasn't that he felt that the Caucasians were necessarily utterly really superior and more desirable. So, for example, if I'm right, he loved the Tahitians. He didn't much like the Maoris, because you may know that the Maoris were a ferocious people. When you see them on the rugby team, you can understand. But they were really ferocious people. They were forever fighting with each other. There's a famous story about one group of Maoris who went off to the east from New Zealand and found the Chatham Islands, which are a small group of islands. And they prospered there for quite a long time, completely forgotten, by the way, by the people back in New Zealand, who had no contact with them for a very long time. And on these small islands, this group of Maoris became pacific, because you couldn't be thoroughly aggressive in a tiny group of islands. You had to get on. So they became pacifists. They had then the misfortune that a bunch of their relatives from New Zealand found them and wiped them all out. So in any case, he didn't much like this aspect of Maori culture. He, I think I might be saying, and maybe from your book, I think you may have said how much he admired the South African natives, and he confidently expected that they would come to rule South Africa with great ability. So, racist, yes, in the sense that there are races, which I would say, I think genetically, well, you know, you can actually, if you like, type somebody blind genetically and say yes, they're most likely either Caucasian or of the Chinese group or of the whatever. You know, you can do this. But the point was, what did he think of them as people? I think he was a thoroughly, and this is something which I think came across in Janet's talk. He was a very kindly man. He thought they were human beings. I don't think he disparaged them, am I right? He was not a racist in the sense that he detested people automatically because they were of a different race.
Just on that point, this was actually the first time that I've ever seen the subtitle of the origin of the species. I never saw that before the line, so it actually, the minute I saw that, I saw the word race in there and favourable race. And then one of the quotes that you put up when he was talking about the guy Buttons, you know, was about the fact that he seemed to, what he was amazed about was that trip, you know, voyage from being a savage to being what he saw to be a more favourable, you know, developmentally. So the person who had gone to Europe and picked up European ways was higher up on the scale of improved, indeed improved. So.
No. Another thing I mentioned to Janet was that Darwin didn't go to Asia. In the sense, he didn't see India, he didn't see Japan, he didn't see China. And remember that at the time that Europeans first really got to know India, India was a far bigger economy and in many ways a much, much more sophisticated society than many of the parts, if not all, of Europe. So he didn't have that, but nevertheless he was able, as Janet described, to see in the peoples that he did come across that they had cultures and they had quasi-religious practices. So that, you know, Christianity was one amongst many. Yes.
Little hypothetical question. As I was listening to you, I was wondering if Darwin came back today, which of course he would, but if he did, what would he think of us all now? You mentioned fundamentalism earlier on, climate, our very speedy developments. The world now is just entirely different from what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. So, my goodness, what would he think?
Oh yes, this is good as mine. I know that we would exactly be frightened by the pace of change. So he would have been astonished by motor cars. They have trains, of course, but they only went about 10 miles an hour. So the speed of modern life would be very remarkable. So how long would it take to adapt to that? Years, 6 months, something like that. As a culture, I think he would be tremendously pleased that we have managed to relinquish a lot of the religious trappings of his own day. In his own day, there was only one university you could go to without having to sign the 39 Articles. So all of that has loosened up in a way, so education be a very noticeable part of what he would think had improved. He would be interested in electric light.
Genetics.
Genetics. I wouldn't understand genetics. So he was never a lab person. I'm not really a molecular person. We were talking a little earlier today about, of course, he knew cells. The body was made up of cells, but he didn't really think of it in the way that we do now. There's lots of little units, busily working away.
You said something wonderfully interesting to me that you said that he wasn't much of a microscopist.
No.
You need to put that in the context of microscopy and its role in the 19th century. Microscopy was clearly such an important science or method of biology in the 19th century. More and more powerful microscopes. Look at that.
Yeah, just a kind of more philosophical question. So you talked a lot about, the close alignment, between Darwinism and humanism. But is it risky or even mistaken to elevate Darwinism to the level of a complete belief system? And what would Darwin, have thought of that kind of tendency?
Well, we do, don't we? I mean,
Or do we?
Do you know any evolutionary biologists?
Well, I mean, you can argue
Darwinism is it.
it's a theory of biology, which is fine, and it's the greatest theory of biology ever devised, arguably, and that's fine. But you know, there has it been, you know, down in history, we can think of obvious examples where people have maybe abused the sort of, you know, Darwin's ideas and co-opted them into
Yes.
very nefarious kind of so that's the kind of risk I'm alluding to.
Yes.
Just I wouldn't worry too about that.
So of course there's plenty of risks in adopting anything as an overarching theory, especially if it's a scientistic
Yeah.
theory, because it makes people become very reductionistic, very mechanistic, and you've rightly pointed out the very strong link between social Darwinism and Hitler. So there's all kinds of dangers in any scientific theory. I don't think Newton's gravity is quite as bad as Darwin's natural selection. But Darwinism has that in it. It's a social system, really, isn't it? And of course it's dangerous. But I think most people are fairly sensible about it today.
Yeah.
Possibly, as a system of thought, there are other ways of thinking that are coming on through that will collapse. The idea of evolution by natural selection, and we start believing in something else. Possible. That's how science works.
Yeah.
We've been with evolution by natural selection for 200 years. Nearly 200 years. So there's something true in it, but it could expand on to something else that undermines our notions of it. When I was young, very early in my studies, it used to be very amusing to say to people, well, you know, I sometimes wonder if I don't turn around, I see the finger of God writing in the sky. It's all untrue. Everything's possible, and that's what science teaches us. Anything's possible.
Except we should say that the amount of evidence that we have which supports the theory of evolution is undescribably huge.
Of course. Yeah.
And we had a nice discussion about a word, consilience, which is apparently an old word, but the person who brought it into use again recently was a man named E.O. Wilson of Harvard, who Janet knew. He died a few years ago, a year ago, I think, in his 90s. He'd written 30 or 40 books, he'd won up numerous Pulitzer prizes. He was a student, he was an entomologist. But he had this, he wrote a book called Consilience. And Consilience is the following phenomenon, that a group of people working over a period of time come up with a great idea. And as it were, out of the blue, somewhere else, another group of people are working away, and they come up and no, it's the same idea. But it has been produced by different kinds of science. And we happen to know, or Janet and I and other geneticists here know, that the great biologists of the 19th century, the zoologists and botanists, came up with the family trees, the trees of life. And then along in the middle to late 20th century come the molecular geneticists. And they start looking at DNA molecules. And they couldn't give a hoot where the DNA molecules came from, but they're able to construct trees, saying, now we've got a tree of DNA molecules. And then at the end of this, they say, oh, well, now this DNA molecule, oh yes, that came from an orangutan. Oh boy, and next to it, very close to it, is a DNA molecule from a gorilla. Boy, there's the chimpanzee and there's a human. They didn't need to know where the DNA came from to construct a tree, to find it's the same tree. And that's just a lovely example of the power of scientific evidence coming from many different lines, which lead us to have enormous confidence in the current broad theories of evolution. Not to say we will not embellish them or change them somewhat. I agree, of course. Yes, indeed.
How would you rate epigenetics as a challenge to Darwinism?
It's absolutely not. It's a misused word. It was invented by a man called Wellington in Edinburgh. It has been misused, abused, and turned into something entirely different, including by colleagues of my own. It's, in my own personal opinion, as of now, it doesn't have any disturbing effect on Darwin.
Oh, no, and I'm delighted with your answer, and I'm not offended by it. I just really wanted to know, because as you say, that word is thrown around, and I've just been hearing bits and pieces about it recently, and going, oh right, well, there you
there's
go.
lots of bits and pieces. But people love to, it's a favourite thing for scientists to think that they've got some idea which completely dismantles something very great. So there's a bit of that going on. Now, epigenetics, by the way, has transformed into essentially genetic control systems. Epigenetics is essentially the study of genetic control systems. That's not what Waddington thought it was way back in the 1950s in London, but that's a detail. So I don't think it has any significant effect. I mean, we will find some very peculiar things. So, for example, I'm quite confident that there will be examples of real Lamarckism, okay? And Lamarck is much maligned, but I can imagine systems which are Lamarckian. But they will not disturb the great generality of Darwinian but it's a nice, thank you.
Could you tell us a bit more about Darwin's views on eugenism at his time? Human evolution? No, sorry, on eugenism.
Eugenics. Oh. So he didn't use the word before, but he clearly felt that one could use contraception and other kinds of regulation in marriage and outside marriage.
So he didn't make much use of it himself.
To better the human race. He thought it was, generally speaking, a good idea to improve the human race. But he had nothing like the grasp of the field that somebody like Francis Galton had, who coins the word eugenics, positive eugenics and negative eugenics. And Galton had a whole system for increasing the birth rate of the better people and reducing the birth rate of the less successful people. And Darwin has nothing to say about that. I wouldn't like to guess what he would say, but he has nothing to say about that. So the ideas are all there in Darwin, and they're picked up and used in other schemes that have other aims. And it's a very interesting and difficult question. How much do we blame Darwin for the way that his ideas are used? As he didn't propose eugenics, but he gave the system that could allow it to happen. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful audience out there.
I have a question. What is Darwin's view on our purpose of our existence in this world, and why are we here?
We have no purpose. We are simply, we have emerged through adaptive selective processes into what we are. He thought we were wonderful, fascinating objects. The height of creativity, he thought, but that an insect was just as astonishing an evolutionary product as we are. So he was full of the wonder of the natural world. There's no question about that. But he didn't attribute it to a creator. There's nothing.
But
we have no purpose.
But I think, as you said, I mean, he did, he believed in society, social behavior. He was interested in, as you said, in pointing out that our social behaviors were not unique to human beings, that there were analogues or something similar in animals. So, in the sense that it's plain that animals love the members of their own species. You can see it with in pets and so on. You can see how animals appear to love each other. So he would have, I think, thinking about what purposes there are in life. Why should we behave in a particular way? It's another way of asking the question. And I think perhaps Darwin saw our behavior as the product of evolution. So the way we appear to have purposes, those purposes are derived from our evolutionary history and then subsequently our social history. And remember the huge impact of social evolution gradually taking over from biological evolution, and the role that education plays, for example, in the formation of the way we behave and so on and so forth. At least that's a few thoughts. But you want Janet to answer these questions. Yes?
So Darwin saw an evolution in our history, in our historical past. Did he see anything for our future?
Yes, he thought we were still evolving, but we're evolving socially. He didn't think we were going to regrow a tail or anything like that. It's quite...
So we'd reached the zenith of our biological form.
And that's something that creationists and fundamentalists will sometimes say, is that why aren't we evolving a fifth arm? It would be so useful. And they are completely misunderstanding that we only have what we have because we've been evolved from other things. We can't grow another arm. He doesn't talk very much about where he thinks we might be going, but he certainly believes evolution is a process that has not stopped. Thank you for that question. And Nancy, what was your question?
Yeah, just very quickly. What would Darwin, would you suggest, what would he attribute to the suffering of human beings currently? I don't know if you perhaps touched on it. Would he consider behaviour, consequences of behaviour? Is this the trend he would go on, or would he have an opinion on what the suffering that goes with being human?
He wished there was no suffering, and that was one of the things that helped him stop believing in a God, because how could a God who's crafted human beings, created the world, put us in the world, how could he also make us all suffer? It seemed pointless to him. And so he hated suffering. And wasn't a moral philosopher. He wasn't good in that area. All he could say was that there seems to be suffering. There's pain. And it's because of our animal ancestry that we suffer. We have a moral sense that has emerged from our animal ancestry, from animal social relations. He thinks the moral sense has emerged in human beings.
Through nurturing.
Yes.
Through nurturing.
Through nurturing, yeah. Through the maternal sense.
The maternal side,
absolutely, yes. And the social sense, wishing to live in family groups and that sort of thing. So that we have become biologically, we are in a situation where suffering happens and we don't have the equipment to deal with it.
Because we've still got our reptilian brain, in effect, controlling us.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. But that doesn't make it any easier to suffer.
No.
He suffered. And wished to do. Thank you.
We have had really splendid evenings, and I think we should allow Janet to. We should let her off anyway. And we really don't want to. We've been such a really splendid evening, a really beautiful exchange of ideas, and you have all played your part in some lovely questions. And if I have one hope from this, it is that we will all go home thinking a bit more warmly, if it's possible to think more warmly of Darwin. He's a really remarkable man who had to conclude, that nature is red in tooth and claw, and we are the product of this. We can do better because of cultural, social evolution, and let's hope that we can. And let's hope that we get through this awful period in which our world happens to be just at the present time. But it's been a huge pleasure, and I have one word of very good news for you. Janet is about to retire from Harvard. And she's about to, yes, it's a wonderful piece of news because she's going to return to England. And she'll be in Sussex, I think, West Sussex. And the one thing we want to say to all of us, I'm sure, Janet, is we hope that in the years to come you'll be able to pop over from Sussex and speak to us again.
Yes.